I thought we might start by asking you, what is it that you do and why is it so important to you?
Well, I'm a psychologist first. I had a private practice for over 20 years in the Midwest of the United States, and then was widowed in 2015. And in my grief, rushed into the next relationship and ended up marrying somebody that was very, very toxic. And that was pretty devastating. And I had already closed my practice to care for my late husband who had passed away from cancer. So when I exited that relationship, I was sort of in this quandary. What do I do? What's my next step? I also had an ill son at the time. So I started writing. I'd already been writing for a little while and saw that as a way to be able to bridge what I'd experienced with my education and my knowledge. And so then I began to really kind of move in the direction of trauma work and in the sense of education and bringing awareness. But my first focus was trying to heal from what happened. So the writing was really actually an expression of my efforts to make sense of what I had just survived.
Hmm. Without a doubt, you are the leading expert in toxic relationships, and you seriously are such an important voice on the topic of abusive relationships. And my question from that is, where did that all begin? Where did that begin the journey of your life?
I'd always had a fascination with people and how people worked. I grew up in a kind of a troubled home. So my way of understanding the world is to deconstruct patterns and try to make sense of things. So I at first kind of played around with the idea of being a physician, but then I realized there's another way to approach the person, and that is to understand the mind and the way that the mind works.
Yeah, I really did see how you approach the person in your book and how like you delve into all these characteristics of these different people. It was really interesting.
I just find the way that we're more alike than we like to think that we are. I mean, each
Yeah.
of us want to think that we're sort of very unique. And yes, we are. And yes, we are unexplored territory as well. But there's also this commonality, this universality between all of us as well. And psychology sort of tries to understand both nuances, our personhood, our individuality, but also see the way in which we're alike each other.
I'm a strong believer that to kind of understand personhood with kind of nuances, you have to kind of go back to one's earliest years, because as child psychology often asserts, that's really when our character is formed and shaped. And so, could you take me back to your earliest years, the context that's most relevant to your life?
So for me, the other context that was going on was we were in the Vietnam War for the United States, and my father was facing a draft. So my parents married, and they immediately sought to have a child so that they could avoid the draft. I mean, nighttime seeing images of the war being played on the news, we ate dinner and those types of things. But in the middle of all of this, my home life was also just filled with lots of struggles, parents struggling with each other, being young parents with difficult families. And then there was also abuse that I was struggling with. There was sexual abuse that was early on that happened to my sisters and I with a family member. And, you know, so that here's all this kind of trauma and drama and grief and feeling very unprotected, unsafe. So it was just really my way of making through it was to spend a lot of time on my own. I sort of did a lot of like mental activities, like I'd create puzzles and poetry and those types of things. I would take long walks on my own. I did a lot of things with my interior world, tried to make sense of what was happening with all this chaos that was happening.
I'm really sorry to hear that you went through that. But nonetheless, I really do thank you for your openness, because I think in order to really understand someone, you do have to kind of go back to their earliest years. I mean, I think we're really all kind of molded by our earliest context, whether it be our deep characteristics or our deep passions. I think all of that really is nurtured in our earliest years. So, I mean, if I was in the walls of your home at that time, what would I have felt or seen or experienced in relation to the sort of relationship between your parents?
They were actually quite loving and warm to each other, but they were sort of busy in their lives and busy with trying to manage very complex family dynamics. And I just felt like as children, we were sort of the add on. Our
Yes.
job was to sort of be seen and not heard. So it was a close knit family in a lot of ways, but the way that we raise children today is vastly different than the way that they raised children then. That was sort of the feeling that I had as a child.
Yeah, when you look back on your parents' relationship, how in hindsight did that shape your perception of, say, love? Is there anything you look back and sort of think, that's why I became this particular way as a romantic partner? Or that's why I navigated certain relationships in certain ways?
Yeah, my parents were very loving. They loved each other all the way to the end. It was a difficult relationship, though. I would say they had an incredible physical connection where you just knew they adored each other and depended on each other, but they didn't really know how to share emotionally, intimately. Like, I don't think that they talked about secrets or the things that scared them. I don't think they really went there with each other much. I don't even think they have the language for it with each other. So I got to see this close relationship, which was a very affectionate, but I didn't see these big, rich conversations. And then the other big piece that was happening is that men were very much centered in the life of the home. So my father was waited on and sort of taken care of. And, he worked hard. Now, granted, he worked 12, 16-hour days most days of the
Yeah.
week. So I knew he was exhausted and really stressed and hardworking person, but there wasn't sort of like that was expected, that's what women did, and so that carried through too into my first marriage with my late husband. It's that, he also worked very hard, but he had more of a job that stayed like 8 to 10 hours a day, maybe 8 to 11 hours a day. But on the other hand, it was expected that I would carry the whole home. I think that then set me up to then, sort of when I met this most recent relationship, to think that to really respect his masculinity, to really wanted to make sure that he felt important, respected, and I didn't realize that that made me at risk for being abused. And here's another piece that I've really been thinking a lot about is my identity, and I think this is true for at least for my parents and my grandparents. Identity as a woman came through the identity of the relationship. It was very hard for me to think of myself separate from a relationship. I know people say to each other, you should just leave. And things start to get bad, just walk up. You should just step out and leave. But for me, that was part of who I was, leave myself. If I left the relationship, I was leaving myself, not just leaving the relationship, because myself was a part of that relationship. Its healthiness reflected on me. So it's really kind of hard to separate that all out. And I saw the same thing from my grandparents and my parents as well. You see two separate people. I didn't feel like I was a complete separate individual outside of that relationship. But that's something that's happened now, but it hadn't happened until just recently.